The moment the new inmate stepped into the cafeteria, the chatter stopped, and all eyes turned toward him. He was old, composed, and out of place in a prison full of men who thrived on chaos. Jack the Bull Larkin, the notorious gang leader, wasted no time making his move. "What's this, Grandpa? Lost your way to the retirement home?" he sneered, stepping in front of the old man with a grin that dared him to react. But Oliver Hart didn't flinch. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Jack's, calm as ever, his presence completely unshaken by the aggression in the room. Then, in a blur of motion, the tray flew from Oliver's hands and Jack was on the floor before anyone could react. The room went silent. No one had expected the frail old man to be anything more than a target. But what they didn't know was that Oliver Hart was no ordinary inmate. He was a retired kung fu master with a past that could shatter their entire world. Stay with me, because what happened next not only shocked the inmates, it froze the guards in their tracks. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get into it. The clang of the prison gates reverberated through Blackstone Penitentiary, a grim sound that echoed deep into the cavernous halls. The air was thick with the scent of old concrete and metallic decay. The prison loomed like a fortress, surrounded by high walls topped with barbed wire, as if daring anyone to challenge its authority. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating, filled with the murmurs of inmates, the clatter of metal bars, and the occasional shout of a guard barking orders. Blackstone was a place where fear was currency, and power was earned through violence. Oliver Hart walked through the heavy steel doors, his orange jumpsuit hanging loosely around his frail 72-year-old frame. The sight of him, a quiet, elderly man, seemed out of place amidst the hulking, intimidating figures of the other prisoners. He moved with a calmness that was almost out of sync with the chaos around him. His shoulders were straight, his posture poised, and his eyes, piercing and steady, took in everything with the awareness of someone who had spent a lifetime practicing restraint. He didn't seem concerned by the grim atmosphere. In fact, it was as if he had seen much worse in his life, and the prison's oppressive air was just another challenge to overcome. As Oliver was led down the long corridor toward his cell, the other inmates eyed him curiously. Some whispered among themselves, skeptical of his presence. Others laughed, assuming that this old man would be an easy target. But despite the stares and the snickers, Oliver remained unchanged. His breath even, his movements slow but deliberate. There was an air of unspoken authority about him, something that didn't fit with the fragile appearance he projected. At the far end of the block, Jack the Bull Larkin was holding court with his crew in the cafeteria, his massive figure impossible to ignore. Jack was the undisputed king of Blackstone. His tattoos, like maps of violence, covered his arms, and his presence commanded instant obedience. He was a man who thrived on intimidation, fear, and control, and he made sure the entire block knew who was in charge. He watched the new arrival through the large windows of the cafeteria, sizing him up like a predator examining prey. Oliver had heard about Jack from the moment he arrived, but he paid him no mind. He wasn't here to play politics or prove himself in the brutal hierarchy of Blackstone. His past was his own, and he kept it hidden behind a calm, implacable demeanor. But Jack saw Oliver's age and frailty as an opportunity. To him, this was a man who could be easily broken, a man who would cower, who would be another number in the system. Jack smirked, deciding that he would be the one to assert his dominance first. As Oliver made his way to the cafeteria to grab his meal, Jack blocked his path, flanked by his loyal followers. The cafeteria went quiet as Jack stepped forward, a grin spreading across his face. Well, what do we have here?" He sneered, his voice loud enough to carry across the room. "Looks like Grandpa's lost his way." Oliver paused, his calm eyes meeting Jack's with a look of indifference. He didn't flinch, didn't show any fear. He simply stood still, observing. Jack shoved Oliver in the chest with a force meant to knock him off balance, expecting the old man to stumble. But Oliver's feet didn't move. He absorbed the force, his breathing steady, as though nothing had happened. The silence in the cafeteria deepened, and the eyes of every inmate in the room were suddenly focused on the two men. Jack's eyes narrowed. "You think you're tough, old man?" He growled, his tone dripping with disdain. He swung a punch toward Oliver's face, a wild, unrestrained blow designed to break the old man's spirit. But Oliver was ready. With a fluid motion, he deflected the punch effortlessly, the movement so precise it seemed like it was choreographed. In one smooth motion, he shifted his weight, leaving Jack off balance. The blow never landed, and Jack stumbled backward, his massive frame unable to maintain the momentum. The cafeteria, still as a tomb, seemed to hold its breath as the moment stretched on. Oliver didn't move from his spot, still standing tall and composed. He had shown no aggression, no anger, only the quiet power of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering discipline. But it was clear now that Jack had underestimated him. As the room remained silent, the tension between the two men hung heavy in the air. Jack's pride had been wounded, and the crowd was waiting to see what would happen next. In that moment, Oliver's presence was no longer just that of an elderly man. He was a force to be reckoned with. The fight hadn't even started yet, but already the power dynamics within the cafeteria were beginning to shift. Jack, though momentarily stunned, was not one to back down easily. His face flushed with embarrassment and rage, and he straightened, towering over Oliver. This was only the beginning. He would not let this old man show him up. Not here. Not in front of his crew. As the tension reached its peak, Oliver remained calm, his posture still relaxed, his hands hanging by his sides. The moment had come. Jack made his next move, but this time it was not the violence of the blow that mattered. It was the calmness that Oliver carried with him, the beginning of something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. And so, the first move in the game was made. The quiet, composed man had just stepped into the lion's den. But there was much more to him than met the eye. And Jack, for the first time, was about to learn that underestimating this man would be his greatest mistake. The buzz of activity in the cafeteria echoed through the thick steel walls of Blackstone Penitentiary. It was lunch hour, and the room was alive with the noise of trays clattering, inmates talking in low voices, and the occasional shout of a guard barking orders. The harsh, fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, and the smell of burnt food and stale air hung heavy in the room. Despite the seemingly ordinary chaos, there was a quiet tension, as though every inmate in the room could feel the storm brewing. Even if they didn't know exactly what would trigger it, Oliver Hart stood in the cafeteria line, his back straight, his movements slow but deliberate. His appearance, with his thinning white hair, weathered skin, and lean figure, made him seem out of place among the rough, brawny men around him. His hands were steady as he picked up a tray, and though the food was unappetizing, grayish eggs, rubbery bacon, and a slice of bread as hard as a rock, he took it with the same calm acceptance that had marked every other part of his life. Around him, inmates cast curious glances in his direction. Some whispered to each other, their eyes flicking to the old man, who didn't seem scared or intimidated by the environment. The room had a strange air about it. The usual posturing and bravado were absent. Everyone knew who ruled this block, and they knew that anyone who wanted to survive had to respect that power. Jack the Bull Larkin was the undisputed king of Blackstone, and his presence was unmistakable. At 6'5", and built like a wrecking ball, he dominated the cafeteria with his sheer size alone. The tattoos covering his arms told a story of violence, of years spent in the system, and of his unchallenged reign over the inmates. His crew surrounded him like loyal dogs, each man a reflection of Jack's own brutality. But today, Jack wasn't just sitting at his usual table. Today, he had his eyes locked on Oliver, the new inmate who had somehow managed to catch his attention. The first interaction came with a burst of arrogance. As Oliver made his way to a table, Jack blocked his path. His gang smirked behind him, waiting for the old man to react. The cafeteria fell into a quiet, expectant lull. Jack's voice rang out like a bell, loud and taunting. Well, he said, his voice carrying across the room. Look what we got here. Somebody's grandpa got himself locked up, huh? He stepped closer, sizing Oliver up with a leering grin. His crew chuckled along with him, clearly entertained by the old man's presence. Oliver, however, didn't flinch. He stood still, his back straight, his gaze unfazed as it met Jack's eyes. The calmness in Oliver's expression seemed to mock Jack's obvious attempts to intimidate him. He didn't respond verbally, but the silence hung heavy between them, as though Oliver were daring Jack to make his move. Jack, not used to being ignored, grew bolder. "What's the matter, old man?" he sneered, stepping forward and shoving Oliver's shoulder with surprising force. He expected the frail old man to stumble or show some sign of fear, but Oliver didn't budge. His feet were planted firmly on the floor, his body rock-solid despite his age. The shove had no effect. Oliver simply absorbed it, his posture unyielding. A murmur ran through the cafeteria. The power dynamic in the room had shifted ever so slightly, and the inmates, always quick to recognize a challenge, began to watch more closely. Jack's face flushed red with frustration. He had underestimated this man. Oliver didn't even flinch. "Did you just push me, Grandpa?" Jack growled, the amusement gone from his voice. The menace in his tone was clear, and his crew tensed, sensing the impending escalation. Jack wasn't used to being disrespected, and no one had ever dared to stand their ground against him, especially not someone who looked as fragile as Oliver. Oliver's eyes never left Jack's. There was no fear, no anger, only an eerie calm. His breathing remained steady, his posture relaxed. The silence between them stretched taut as a wire. Oliver's voice, when he spoke, was low and even. "I don't need to fight you to make my point, Jack," he said simply. "But I will defend myself if I must." Jack's eyes narrowed. He had never been one to back down, and the audacity of this old man, standing there unmoved by his power, irked him more than he could handle. Without another word, Jack's massive fist shot forward, aiming for Oliver's face. It was a punch filled with all the fury of someone trying to reassert their dominance, a punch designed to break and humiliate. But Oliver had already seen it coming, with a movement so fluid and controlled that it seemed like time had slowed. Oliver sidestepped the punch, his body gliding effortlessly to the side. Jack's blow landed harmlessly in the air. Before Jack could process what had happened, Oliver's left hand shot up, gently deflecting the momentum of the punch and redirecting it away from his body. The move was so precise, so practiced, that Jack didn't even realize what had happened until it was too late. Oliver's right hand, as if guided by instinct, moved in an arc toward Jack's chest. His palms struck with surgical precision, landing just below Jack's sternum. It wasn't a powerful blow, it didn't need to be, but it was enough. Jack's body jolted backward, the wind knocked out of him. His massive frame wavered, as if suddenly unsure of its own footing. The cafeteria went deathly silent. The shock on Jack's face was immediate. He had been humiliated, and worse, by a man he thought would be easy prey. For a moment, the entire room stood still, the tension hanging like a thick fog. Jack, the infamous gang leader who controlled everything with fear and violence, had just been made to look weak in front of everyone. Jack staggered backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. His pride had taken a blow far worse than the strike to his chest. His hands clenched into fists, his face contorted with a mix of humiliation and fury. The inmates watched in stunned silence, unsure of what they had just witnessed. Some even stepped back, not daring to breathe as the realization set in. This old man was no joke. You're dead, old man," Jack snarled, his voice a low growl, but there was a tremor in it, a subtle crack in his confidence. "You just signed your own death sentence." But Oliver remained calm. His gaze met Jack's once more, unshaken. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. His calm was his answer, and it was all Jack could handle. Oliver, the frail old man, had just brought down the King of Blackstone in one swift, measured strike. The room was still, the inmates whispering in low voices. Word would spread fast, and the legend of the old man who took down the bull would grow with every passing moment. Oliver didn't care about the respect or the fear that was now slowly replacing Jack's dominance in the cafeteria. He didn't want war, but he knew that some conflicts, no matter how quiet you try to keep them, were unavoidable, as Jack's crew began to whisper among themselves, trying to figure out how to salvage their pride. Oliver calmly turned and walked toward a table. His pace was slow and measured, as if nothing had happened. He picked up his tray, sat down, and began to eat his meal, completely unbothered, and in the hush that followed, the inmates of Blackstone Penitentiary began to realize something. Oliver Hart was not just another old man. He was something far more dangerous, and they would soon learn that underestimating him had been their biggest mistake. The days following Oliver's confrontation with Jack the Bull Larkin were filled with a strange, palpable shift in the air around Blackstone Penitentiary. What had started as a single, humiliating moment for Jack in the cafeteria quickly rippled throughout the prison, spreading like wildfire. Inmates whispered in dark corners, their voices filled with disbelief and awe. Some saw Oliver's act as a sign of hope, a reminder that the prison's brutal hierarchy wasn't as unbreakable as it seemed. Others, more cynical, saw it as a rare moment of weakness, something to be exploited. At first, the looks Oliver received were curious. Men who would normally have averted their gaze when walking by another inmate began to look at him directly. There was respect in their eyes, but there was also something else, fear. They didn't know what to make of the old man who had stood against the prison's king and won. The inmates who once sneered at him now cast sidelong glances, as if uncertain whether to offer a nod of respect or retreat into the shadows. Oliver, however, remained the same. He walked the halls with the same measured steps, his eyes always alert, taking in his surroundings with a quiet awareness. He could feel the shift. The air seemed thicker, charged with tension. His reputation had begun to precede him. In a place like Blackstone, that was both a blessing and a curse. Meanwhile, Jack's anger simmered. He could feel the sting of the defeat in his gut every time he closed his eyes, and every inch of his pride was wounded. Jack had ruled Blackstone with an iron fist for years, and no one had ever dared challenge him, certainly not a frail old man with nothing to lose. But now everything had changed. His reign had been disrupted in front of everyone, and that kind of humiliation couldn't go unanswered. Jack wasn't just angry, he was furious. The more he stewed over the encounter, the more desperate he became to make Oliver pay. His first order of business was to rally his crew. He gathered his most trusted followers, men who had served him for years, and they huddled together in a dark corner of the prison yard, their voices low and urgent. The plan was simple. Oliver Hart had embarrassed Jack in front of the whole block, and that couldn't stand. He needed to break him, make an example of him, and remind everyone that Jack the Bull Larkin was untouchable. But this time, Jack knew he had to be smart about it. He couldn't just rush in blindly like before. He had to wait for the right moment. Oliver's moment of weakness, Jack's reputation, for all the power he commanded, had its limits. And now, more than ever, Jack's pride was something he had to rebuild. He wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. The first strike had been too quick, too calculated. This time, he would drag the humiliation out. He would bring Oliver to his knees, slowly, painfully. And in front of everyone, Jack enlisted help from dangerous inmates in other parts of the prison. Men who weren't just thugs, they were calculated, ruthless, and had no problem breaking a man down physically and mentally. These were the kind of men Jack trusted, the kind who could make someone's life a living hell. They were from different blocks with their own allegiances, but Jack's promises of power and revenge had a way of making men forget their differences. They all wanted to see Oliver broken, to see him crumble under the weight of Blackstone's true rulers. But Oliver, for all the whispers that followed him, was unfazed. He moved through the days as he always did, maintaining his calm, observing his environment without engaging with the chaos around him. In his small cell he meditated daily, breathing deeply, clearing his mind and centering himself. This was his sanctuary, a place where nothing could touch him, a place where he could remain true to his purpose. He knew Jack would come for him again. He had expected it. A man like Jack couldn't let an affront like the one Oliver had dealt him slide for long. But Oliver refused to be rattled. His life had been full of challenges, and Blackstone was no different. The difference here was that, unlike the violence that fueled this place, Oliver was not driven by anger. He was driven by control, by peace, by strength, inner strength. He would not be drawn into a battle of ego. If Jack wanted to test him again, so be it. Oliver was ready to face it. Days passed, and the tension between Oliver and Jack began to build like a storm cloud on the horizon. The inmates, too, felt the brewing conflict. Some looked to Oliver with renewed respect, especially the younger inmates who had never seen anyone stand up to the system before. Among them was Marcus, a quiet young man who had been watching Oliver from a distance. At first, Marcus had been wary of Oliver. He had assumed the old man was just another weakling who would fall in line, a victim of the prison system. But after the cafeteria incident, Marcus began to see something different. Oliver wasn't just surviving, he was living in this place. In a way most people couldn't. He carried himself with an unshakable calm, something that made Marcus feel safer, as though Oliver could weather any storm. Marcus often watched Oliver from the corner of his eye, marveling at his steady presence. He noticed how Oliver seemed to observe everything around him without ever reacting impulsively. Oliver had become a mystery, a puzzle that Marcus was eager to understand. One evening, as they sat in the mess hall together, Marcus found the courage to speak. "You know," he began quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, "most guys in here, new guys especially, they're all scared or angry. But you don't seem either of those things. You just stay calm." Oliver didn't look up from his meal. He continued to chew slowly, his gaze focused on the tray in front of him. "Fear and anger cloud your judgment, Marcus. Clarity comes from stillness. When you learn to find peace inside, the outside world becomes easier to navigate." Marcus nodded, though he didn't quite understand what Oliver meant. He had never known a life where stillness had any power. The world around him had always been one of chaos, of survival at any cost. But something in Oliver's words made him think. It was as if Oliver had a secret, a strength that Marcus couldn't quite grasp, but wanted desperately to. The next morning, Jack began to make his move. In the yard, he gathered his crew and the hired muscle from the other blocks, preparing to take action. This time Jack had a plan. He knew he couldn't afford to let his pride be trampled again, not without teaching Oliver a lesson. But there was something else Jack was starting to realize. Oliver wasn't just a threat to his ego, he was a threat to everything Jack had built. If Oliver wasn't broken soon, the respect he had earned from the other inmates would only grow, and Jack could not allow that. He needed to strike when Oliver was vulnerable, when he least expected it. Oliver, however, remained undisturbed. He knew the storm was coming. But unlike Jack, he wasn't rushing into it. He wasn't chasing the fight. He was waiting for it. And when it came, he would face it with the same calm strength that had carried him through every challenge in his life. Days passed in Blackstone Penitentiary, and the stillness that hung around Oliver Hart was growing more profound. It was as though the weight of his presence had cast a long shadow across the entire block, and with each day, more inmates felt the pull of his calm. It wasn't loud, it wasn't brash, but Oliver's unshakable tranquility had a subtle power that was impossible to ignore. The power of quiet strength, of a man who had been tested and forged by a lifetime of discipline, now finding peace in a place defined by violence. Jack Larkin, however, couldn't stand it. His frustration was like a fever, burning hotter with every passing hour. He had tried to provoke Oliver, to make the old man crack, but each attempt only seemed to deepen Oliver's calm. Every time Jack or his crew tried to push him, to bait him into a fight or a confrontation, Oliver remained unresponsive, his posture unyielding, his eyes steady. It drove Jack mad. Every snide comment, every shove, every threat seemed to have no effect on Oliver. It was as though the old man was immune to everything Jack had used to control this place for so long. One afternoon, Jack stood in the prison yard with his gang, watching as Oliver walked past them without so much as a glance. He had been walking the same route for days now, moving in and out of the yard with the same quiet dignity. Jack, ever the predator, saw an opportunity. This time, he wasn't going to let Oliver walk by untouched. He stepped forward, blocking Oliver's path with the same taunting smirk he had worn in the cafeteria. Well, look who it is," Jack said, his voice dripping with mockery. "You still think you're untouchable, old man?" Oliver stopped in his tracks but didn't respond. His gaze remained calm, his hands at his sides. His only reaction was the slightest shift in his posture, a subtle movement that spoke volumes to anyone paying attention. He was ready, but he wouldn't bite. He wouldn't rise to the bait. Jack's gang surrounded Oliver, their grins wide and teeth bared. "What's the matter, Grandpa?" One of them jeered. "You too good to talk to us now?" Still, Oliver said nothing. His silence was a force, an unspoken defiance that unnerved them more than any words could. Jack's jaw clenched, the anger rising inside him, but he refused to show it. He took a step forward, shoving Oliver in the shoulder with more force than before. "You're a dead man walking if you don't start showing some respect," Jack snarled. But once again, Oliver didn't flinch. The shove didn't even make him stumble. He simply stood there, absorbing the force like an immovable rock. Jack's breath hitched, his anger now boiling over. He was losing control and he hated it. "Are you deaf, old man?" I said, "Move." The crowd of inmates gathered around them started to murmur, the tension in the air growing thick. Some watched with amusement, others with curiosity. They had seen Jack intimidate countless others, break men who had been much stronger and younger than Oliver. But this was different. Oliver wasn't just standing up to Jack. He was making Jack look small, weak, insignificant. That more than anything was what irked Jack the most. Oliver turned slightly, looking Jack dead in the eye for the first time since the encounter began. His voice was calm, almost soothing in its quiet strength. "You're angry, Jack," he said, "but you don't need to be. I've already told you I don't want to fight. But if you push me, I will." There was no threat in Oliver's words, no malice, just a simple statement of fact. And yet, to those who were listening, it was more powerful than anything Jack could have said. Oliver wasn't afraid of Jack or his gang. He wasn't even afraid of prison. He had lived through far worse in his past. His strength came from something far deeper than physical power. It was the strength of a man who had found peace within himself and would not be moved. No matter the chaos around him, Jack stepped back, his chest heaving with anger. He knew Oliver wasn't just some weak, helpless old man. He knew he had met someone who was more than capable of standing his ground. But that only made Jack angrier. He wouldn't let Oliver's calm stand unchallenged. Not in his prison, not in his world. The confrontation ended with Jack storming off, his gang following closely behind, murmuring to each other. But the damage was done. The inmates watching, those who had seen Jack's attempt to break Oliver, began to view the old man differently. They didn't fear him, they respected him. There was no violence in Oliver's demeanor, no threats or posturing. He simply was. And that was something they hadn't seen before in this place. As the days passed, more and more inmates began to approach Oliver, drawn to his calm presence. Some asked him about his past, curious about the man who had stood up to Jack without lifting a finger in anger. Others sought guidance, asking how he had remained so composed in the face of such danger. Oliver, ever the teacher, gave them nothing but silence in return. He would not speak of his past. His martial arts training, the years of discipline and control he had honed, were his alone. He had left that life behind when he entered this prison. His focus now was on maintaining the peace within himself, nothing more. Marcus, the young inmate who had started watching Oliver from afar, found himself gravitating toward him more and more. He was fascinated by Oliver's unshakable calm, and how he seemed to carry a weight far beyond the physical. Every time Marcus saw Oliver walk through the yard, every time he saw the way the older man faced the world without fear, he found himself drawn in. There was something magnetic about Oliver, something Marcus couldn't quite understand, but wanted to learn. One evening, after a long day of work, Marcus approached Oliver in the courtyard. "How do you do it?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you stay so calm, so strong?" Oliver glanced at him but said nothing for a moment. Then with a soft sigh he spoke, his voice steady and measured. "Strength comes from within, Marcus. It doesn't come from how much you can lift or how many men you can fight. It comes from being at peace with who you are. And being at peace means accepting the world as it is, not as you wish it to be." Marcus nodded, though he didn't fully understand. But the words lingered in his mind, haunting him in the days that followed. There was something about Oliver that made him feel like maybe, Just maybe. There was a way out of the endless cycle of violence that defined Blackstone. But even as Oliver found peace, Jack Larkin's anger continued to simmer. His plan for Oliver's downfall was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Jack, now more determined than ever to break Oliver, had begun to gather his crew again, this time with a calculated sense of purpose. He had learned from his previous mistake. He wouldn't attack when Oliver was strong. He would wait until the old man's guard was down, until he was vulnerable. Then Jack would strike. And this time it would be final. The storm was coming. And Oliver, despite his calm, knew it. The question was no longer if the attack would come, but when. The cafeteria was unusually quiet, as Oliver Hart sat at his usual spot, a table near the corner, his back to the wall. His meal was untouched, the tray before him a mere formality. His gaze was distant, as though he wasn't really seeing the greasy eggs and dry toast on his tray, but instead lost in his thoughts. The rhythmic clinking of trays, the murmurs of inmates speaking in hushed tones, it all seemed to blend into the background. The weight of his stillness in this chaotic world was his shield, and he wore it like armor. Oliver had known this moment was coming. He had felt the tension in the air in the days since the incident with Jack Larkin in the yard. Jack had been quiet, but Oliver could sense the building rage, the way the power dynamics had shifted in Blackstone Penitentiary. It wasn't about to be forgotten. Jack was planning something that would finally bring Oliver down, and so Oliver waited. He had no fear. Fear to him was just another emotion to be controlled, another distraction to be overcome. He knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. Then the sound of heavy boots echoed in the distance, growing louder with each step. The cafeteria doors swung open, and a low murmur spread through the room. Jack the Bull Larkin strode into the cafeteria, his massive frame taking up the doorway like a storm cloud blocking the sun. His crew followed closely behind, 10 to 15 of the toughest men Blackstone had to offer. Each one of them had a reputation, brutal, unrelenting, and loyal to Jack. The message was clear. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a declaration of war. As Jack made his way across the room, the murmurs grew louder. Some inmates shrank back, their heads down, hoping to avoid the impending chaos. Others watched with anticipation, knowing this was going to be a fight to remember. Oliver remained seated, his hands resting on the table, his back straight, his breathing slow and even. His eyes never left Jack's. The old man hadn't moved a muscle, but his presence was undeniable. The room seemed to hold its breath as Jack's gaze locked onto Oliver, his lips curling into a sneer. "You think you've won, old man?" Jack's voice boomed, loud enough to make the walls shake. "You think just 'cause you got lucky last time that I'm gonna let you walk out of here untouched?" Jack's gang surrounded Oliver, flanking him on all sides. They grinned, cracking their knuckles, itching for a fight. Some of them carried improvised weapons, broken shivs, rusted pipes, and anything else that could be turned into a tool of violence. But Oliver didn't flinch. He simply sat, calm as ever, his hands still resting on the edge of his tray. He didn't need to move. He knew exactly what was coming. "Get up," Jack growled, his voice low and menacing. "We're going to do this the hard way." The first man lunged, a thug with a shaved head and a chain wrapped around his fist. Oliver's eyes never left him as he moved, his body effortlessly flowing into motion. With one fluid motion, Oliver sidestepped, his hand catching the chain mid-swing and twisting it out of the man's grasp. The thug staggered forward, and with a sharp, controlled strike to his side, he crumpled to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the floor. The next two men rushed him from either side, swinging makeshift clubs. Oliver didn't wait. As one swung for his head, Oliver ducked low, letting the weapon pass over him. His hand shot out, striking the attacker's wrist with pinpoint accuracy, disarming him in a single movement. The man yelped, clutching his arm as the club clattered to the floor. Oliver spun, using his momentum to land a blow to the other man's gut, sending him doubling over, gasping for air. The rest of Jack's crew closed in, trying to overwhelm him with sheer numbers. But Oliver remained calm, his movements controlled and precise. His body moved like water flowing around rocks, fluid, effortless, always staying one step ahead. He was a master of efficiency, each strike landing with purpose, each movement a calculated response to his attacker's aggression. In mere moments, 5 of Jack's men were down on the ground, incapacitated but unharmed. Oliver's strikes were swift and precise, aimed only at disabling his attackers without causing lasting damage. He wasn't here to kill, and he wasn't here to prove anything. He was simply showing them that no matter how many came at him, they could not break his calm. Jack's rage was building, and it was clear to everyone watching that this wasn't just about Oliver anymore. Jack was trying to save face, to maintain his position as the dominant force in Blackstone. The thought of being humiliated in front of his crew, in front of the whole prison, was more than he could stomach. "Enough!" Jack roared, his voice shaking with fury. He shoved his men aside, forcing his way through the chaos to face Oliver directly. His fists were clenched, his eyes wide with rage. "You think you can embarrass me like this?" He swung a wild punch at Oliver, a move filled with all the anger and desperation that had been building inside him for days. But Oliver didn't move. His body, still and calm, was a perfect counterbalance to Jack's unrestrained fury. As the punch came toward him, Oliver effortlessly slipped to the side, his movements smooth and deliberate. Jack's punch whiffed past him, barely missing his face. Oliver's hand shot up, catching Jack's massive arm in a vice-like grip. And with a sharp twist, he brought Jack's body forward, throwing him off balance. With one fluid motion, Oliver's palm struck Jack's chest, a controlled blow that knocked the wind out of him. The larger man stumbled backward, his face contorting in pain and shock. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He had thrown everything he had at this old man, and it hadn't been enough. Jack's massive body hit the floor with a thud, his crew standing frozen, unable to comprehend what they were seeing. The cafeteria was silent now, save for the heavy breathing of the men who had tried to take down Oliver. The guards, who had been slow to intervene, now stood at the doorway, watching the scene unfold. They had seen violence in Blackstone before, but never like this. They knew they couldn't step in yet. This was a power struggle, one that was bigger than just one fight. Oliver remained standing in the center of the room, breathing steady, his posture still dignified. He had faced down Jack and his crew and come out unscathed. His calmness was his victory. As the inmates began to whisper among themselves, a sense of awe settled over them. The old man had done what no one had thought possible. He had brought down the King of Blackstone with nothing but his discipline and control. Jack lay on the ground, humiliated, his chest heaving as he struggled to catch his breath. His pride was in tatters. In the span of a few seconds, he had been dethroned, not by force, but by the quiet strength of a man who refused to be broken. The respect that Oliver had earned in the last few days was now cemented in the eyes of everyone in Blackstone. Oliver turned, his eyes scanning the room, and with a single deliberate step, he walked toward the cafeteria doors. The inmates parted to let him pass, their eyes filled with a mix of fear and admiration. Jack's crew, now thoroughly defeated, huddled together, their confidence shattered. The legend of Oliver Hart had begun, and in Blackstone Penitentiary, legends were never forgotten. The days after the showdown, with Jack the Bull Larkin, were charged with a different energy. The very air in Blackstone Penitentiary seemed to hum with the ripple effects of what had transpired. Word of Oliver's victory spread quickly through the prison, and the shift in power dynamics was unmistakable. Where fear and intimidation had once ruled, now there was a subtle respect for the old man, who had faced down the prison's toughest gang leader, with nothing but his calm and controlled strength. Inmates who once kept their heads down began to approach. Oliver in the yard, in the cafeteria, even during work details. They didn't speak of violence or force, they spoke of peace. Some sought him out for guidance, looking to tap into the calm they saw in him. There were whispers of Oliver's past, of his martial arts expertise, but Oliver refused to be drawn into the prison's politics. He wasn't here to lead a rebellion, nor was he interested in becoming a symbol for those who sought violence as a means of survival. He simply offered what he had always offered: discipline, clarity, and inner peace. I'm not the one you should be looking to for guidance in here, Oliver would say softly, each word carrying the weight of years of experience. The real answers lie within you, if you're willing to find them. Still, his influence grew. Inmates, young and old, began to change the way they looked at their lives behind bars. Some saw him as a mentor, others simply admired the strength of his quiet presence. They began to question the necessity of constant violence, of the never-ending cycle of power struggles that had defined the prison for so long. The walls that had once seemed insurmountable now felt less oppressive, and the old power dynamics were starting to crumble. But Jack's reign wasn't over. Though humiliated, Jack was far from defeated. He spent his days brooding in his corner of Blackstone, nursing his bruised ego and plotting revenge. The gang leader wasn't going to let his humiliation stand for long. Jack's pride had been wounded in a way that only deepened his hatred for Oliver. He had always ruled Blackstone through fear and brutality, and now he couldn't bear the thought of a quiet, elderly man dethroning him so effortlessly. His reputation was in shambles, and Jack was determined to restore it, no matter the cost. Jack's vengeance came in the form of whispers and threats, but his power, once absolute, was beginning to slip away. The inmates no longer feared him in the same way. His once loyal followers began to question his authority, seeing Oliver's composure as a kind of strength they had never known. Even Jack's own crew grew wary of the old man's influence, unsure whether they were still safe under Jack's reign, or whether it was time to follow someone who had proven that strength didn't have to come from violence. The guards, too, were beginning to see Oliver in a new light. For years, they had turned a blind eye to Jack's rule, aware of the gang leader's ability to keep order through fear. But after the cafeteria incident, their attitudes shifted. They began to notice how Oliver moved through the halls, calm, unbothered by the chaos around him. The guards had always kept their distance from the inmates, but now they couldn't help but respect the older man who had stood up to Jack without ever resorting to brutality. One afternoon, as Oliver walked through the yard, a guard who had once ignored him nodded in passing, a small but significant gesture of respect. It wasn't just the guards who noticed, though. The whole prison had begun to change. Where once there had been violence in the air, now there was a subtle shift towards something quieter, something that wasn't based on fear or force. Marcus, the young inmate who had been observing Oliver from the beginning, found himself drawn to the older man more than ever. He would seek him out during meals, quietly sitting next to him in the cafeteria or standing nearby during work detail. Marcus wanted to understand what made Oliver so unshakable, what gave him the strength to remain calm, even in the face of constant provocation. "You don't fear anything, do you?" Marcus asked one afternoon as they sat together in the courtyard. Watching the other inmates move about, Oliver took a slow breath, his gaze on the horizon, where the sky was turning to shades of orange and purple as the sun set. "Fear is just information," he said quietly, his voice steady. "It tells you there's something to be prepared for, but it doesn't need to control your actions." Marcus nodded slowly, processing the words. He'd spent his life in survival mode, reacting to fear and anger without ever understanding that it was possible to live outside of that cycle. But there was something in Oliver's words, something that made him think differently. As Oliver continued his quiet work of maintaining his inner peace, he found himself reflecting on the choices he had made. His life outside of prison had been filled with martial arts, discipline, and teaching, but he had never imagined that those skills would one day help him find peace in a place like Blackstone. He had learned long ago that peace, like strength, had to come from within. But that didn't mean peace was always easy. It came with a cost, the loss of certain comforts, the rejection of violence as a solution, and the willingness to stand alone when necessary. Oliver understood that his actions in Blackstone, though not violent, had changed the prison. They had shown the inmates that there was another way to live, a way that didn't rely on the constant cycle of fear and retribution. He had faced down Jack and his gang, but he knew that his true victory lay in the lives he had quietly touched. The prison might never be free of violence entirely, but in that small corner of Blackstone, Oliver had made a difference. The days passed, and the noise of the prison never quite disappeared. It was always there, the shouts, the clanging of metal, the constant reminder that Blackstone was a place built on violence. But for Oliver it was easier to ignore. He'd found his peace in the middle of it all. One evening, as he sat in his cell, the sounds of the prison echoing faintly in the distance, Oliver looked out through the small barred window. The moon was high in the sky, and for a moment everything seemed still. The weight of the world outside seemed to fade as he focused on the quiet. He was no longer a part of the power struggles, no longer a pawn in a system that thrived on brutality. In this place of violence and chaos, Oliver had found peace. And for the first time in a long while, he felt that peace was worth the cost. The months that followed the showdown in the cafeteria were quiet, almost too quiet. The prison's usual hum of tension and violence seemed to soften around Oliver Hart. He continued his daily routines, teaching, meditating, and maintaining the calm that had become his trademark. The inmates who had once feared Jack the Bull Larkin, or any of the other gang leaders, began to look to Oliver instead. Not as a symbol of brute strength, but as a symbol of something far more powerful, inner peace. Oliver wasn't interested in leading a rebellion or becoming the next kingpin of Blackstone. He had no need for power. He simply offered what he had: discipline, wisdom, and the stillness he had cultivated over decades. He began teaching meditation to the younger inmates, showing them how to control their anger, how to find stillness in the chaos. He didn't force anyone to join his lessons, but slowly, one by one, the younger men began to come to him. They asked for guidance, for something more than just survival. What's the point of surviving if you're just waiting to die? One young inmate had asked him during a late-night meditation session. Oliver had smiled, though the smile was faint. Survival isn't about waiting, my friend. It's about living with purpose, no matter where you are or who you're with. Find your center and nothing can take it from you. His teachings didn't always resonate with everyone. Some inmates, trapped in the endless cycle of violence, couldn't embrace Oliver's way of peace. But for those who did, it was transformative. There was a shift in the atmosphere of Blackstone. Slowly, the sense of oppression that had once weighed on the prison seemed to lift, if only a little. The fear that Jack Larkin had once inspired was replaced by something quieter, something more lasting: respect. Jack's reign of terror was officially over. The few who had once been loyal to him began to scatter, disillusioned by the ease with which Oliver had knocked him down. Even Jack himself had changed. He had gone into hiding, his pride shattered, but the inmates no longer feared him the way they had before. The guards, too, treated Oliver with a new respect. He had become a figure of calm strength, a man who had faced down one of the most dangerous figures in Blackstone without lifting a finger in anger. The guards knew he was different, and they no longer ignored him as they once had. They saw the change he had brought to the prison, and they recognized his quiet authority. As the days passed, Oliver's time in Blackstone Penitentiary began to feel less like a sentence and more like a chapter of his life that had yet to close. His purpose was clear. He wasn't just a man serving time. He was a man living in peace, helping others do the same. But even in this place of brutality, Oliver understood that peace came with a price. He had given up his past, the life he had lived outside, the world of martial arts and teaching, the family he had lost. In return, he had found something deeper, something more important than any victory in the outside world. He had found peace within himself, a peace that no one could take away from him. It was on a quiet morning, as the sun began to rise and the prison walls were bathed in a soft golden light, that Oliver received the news. It was time for his release. There were no dramatic speeches, no loud goodbyes. Oliver had made few friends, but the respect he had earned from the inmates and guards was enough. It was a quiet departure, just as he had lived his time in Blackstone. He gathered his few belongings, a simple bag with his belongings. Nothing extravagant, nothing of significance. He walked through the corridors of the prison for the last time, the familiar clink of his footsteps on the cold floor echoing in the stillness. When he stepped outside the prison gates, the sunlight hit him with a warmth he had not felt in years. The world was waiting for him, but he was no longer the same man who had walked in all those months ago. Oliver paused for a moment at the gates, looking back at the prison that had once held him, now behind him forever. He didn't feel anger or resentment or even relief. He simply felt a quiet, steady sense of completion. He had come to Blackstone a man seeking peace, and he was leaving with it. He had faced down bullies, fought against the power structures that thrived on violence, and found a way to live with honor and control, no matter the circumstances. The world outside was just as chaotic as Blackstone had been, but Oliver knew now that it didn't matter. The power of peace, of inner strength, was something he could carry with him wherever he went. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. As he stepped forward into the unknown, Oliver didn't look back. His path was ahead of him, and it was his to walk with dignity, with calm, and with the quiet strength that had defined him. His time in Blackstone had changed the prison, yes, but it had changed him too, and in the end, that was the greatest victory of all.